Hello and welcome back to Clock Spinning, the podcast of Magic's history as told card by card. I'm Austin, and with me as always is Connor. How are you today, Connor?
You know, I am much better than I have been recently. A couple weeks ago, I was in the hospital with meningitis, and I'm back home feeling good now, so I cannot complain.
I'm glad you're back home and feeling good. For those who don't know, meningitis is a kind of brain infection and not the kind that makes for a fun black aura.
No, it definitely isn't. But I am glad to be back talking about some wonderful Kamigawa cards.
Yep. Yeah, as Connor is nodding at, we are back in the Kamigawa saddle today. For those of you who are joining us more recently, this show started with a card-by-card review of Champions of Kamigawa, and we are building a cube out of Kamigawa block. And we'll talk more about the cube and its goals in a second, and Kamigawa block and Betrayers and so on. But if all of that sounds like way too much preamble and you just want to skip ahead to the card-by-card review of Betrayers of Kamigawa, if you just check your show notes either on YouTube or your podcast app, there should be a timestamp there where you can just jump straight ahead to our first card, Day of Destiny, if you don't want to hear the preamble.
Absolutely. But if you do want to hear the preamble and just a little bit about the second set in Kamigawa block, we're going to just kind of intro a little bit about Betrayers. So Betrayers of Kamigawa is set number 2 in the Kamigawa block. Of course, we talked about Champions already. Now we're starting Betrayers, and it comes back with all of the kind of classic things that we love about Kamigawa. Every rare creature in Betrayers is a legend. We've got plenty of spirits or kami. We have arcane spells and splice onto arcane cards. We've got the various iconic mortal tribes like Kitsune and Nezumi, Orochi, the snakes, samurai. We've got it all. And in Betrayers, we have a very special additional creature type, which is very well loved. We have ninjas.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say ninjas are probably the best remembered thing from the set, apart from perhaps Umizawa's Jite. This is back from a time when magic blocks were 3 sets long, which always created a problem for wizards of like, how do you differentiate the first, second, and third set? And usually their approach was to have the first set introduce the plane and its theme, have the second set build on that and maybe add a little bit more, and then have the third set jog in kind of a weird direction just to keep people interested, which honestly was a pattern that didn't work super well. Maybe we'll talk about that some other time. But in this case, Betrayers largely builds on Champions, but as you're saying, it adds some cool themes like ninjutsu, some a lot of cycles. It adds key counters. It adds the offering mechanic. It adds the shoal cycle. So layers in lots and lots of cycles. And most importantly, honestly, ninjas. We keep talking about ninjas, but honestly, they are probably the coolest part of the set. Although, unfortunately, we won't get to talk about any today because there are no white ninjas.
Oh, sadly, there are not. There are plenty of blue and black ninjas that we're excited about, like Ink Eyes, Servant of Oni, Ninja of the Deep Hours. Actually, just a lot of cool blue and black cards generally. So stick with us as we get to blue and black. But today we're just going to be covering the first half of white in Betrayers. So that is a total of 15 cards.
Betrayers was a small set. It had, I think, oh golly, I should have had this number to hand. It had 165 cards, so quite a small set by modern standards. And I think it's fair to say that white is, I shouldn't be saying this since our job is to get you all interested and excited about these cards, but white is probably not the most exciting color in the set. It struggles in the way that white does in a lot of sets of this era where there's a lot of damage prevention, a lot of life gain, and maybe struggling a little bit for an identity. But there are some really cool cards mixed in here. Some iconic cards like Final Judgment, Opal Eye, Kentaro, the Smiling Cat, Hokori, Dust Drinker, Day of Destiny. And if you don't know all those cards, great. Stick with us because our hope here is to surface interesting, unique cards that you may not have heard of, and maybe they'll find a home in your cube, in some EDH deck, or just in your memory.
And as you've just heard, they all have really great names. So at the very least, these cards have that going for them.
That is absolutely the consistent highlight across Kamigawa block, isn't it? Like, no matter how bad the cards are, how misguided some of the design is, like, the names are there's just bangers. Every other card has some totally awesome name.
Absolutely.
So one quick reminder about the cube, if you're a new listener to the show. So we are building a cube of the original Kamigawa block. And usually when people talk about that, what they talk about is building a set cube. That is a cube whose goal is to emulate the original draft retail environment. And that is not our goal. Our goal here is to build an interesting draft environment that appeals to our tastes, that evokes the memories of Kamigawa block, that evokes the feel of the block, but we're not trying to be bound by original Kamigawa design too tightly. So if a card is really bad, we'll just cut it, and we'll talk more about that rating system in a second. If a card is really cool, we might amp up the quantity above what you would see in an original retail environment. The mana fixing in this block is brutally bad, and so we brought in some lands from outside the block. And so our goal here is to build a cube that's opinionated and interesting and fun to play, that still evokes lots of play patterns and stuff that are reminiscent of the original block.
So you alluded just now to how we're going to be rating these cards and kind of deciding which ones we want to have in the cube, how many we want, how much we like or maybe hate the cards. And we'll be doing that using our patent eligible IMPAB rating system.
And Connor is a patent attorney, and so this is patent eligible, right, Connor?
This is true. Yeah, definitely patent eligible.
Okay, yeah, great.
So IMPAB is an acronym which stands for Instacut, Meh, Playable, Auto Include, and Build Around. So we'll be giving every card we talk about one of these ratings. And in some cases, if we keep the card in, we'll talk about how many copies we want, because as Austin mentioned, this is not a singleton cube. We have some cards that we, want to see a little bit more of. So just to quickly go through each of those different categories, Instacut pretty much speaks for itself. These are cards that we're just cutting right away. We know we don't want them in the cube because they're too weak or too specific. We just don't want them. Meh cards are not great, and that's going to be true of probably a lot of cards in Kamigawa block, but they're not necessarily awful. We may want these for certain niche situations or just as a later draft pick maybe. So that's meh. Playable cards are generally playable in most circumstances. So there's certain cards in Kamigawa block. One that comes to mind that we've talked about a lot is Kitsune Blademaster, that are just pretty good, solid cards, even by maybe more modern standards. So playable is kind of the category that sort of card is going to fit into. Auto include cards, these are things that we know we want to have in the cube. So these are cards that may be especially iconic in kind of the story or flavor of the set, or just cards that we really have a soft spot for or know that we want to have in. Maybe they represent or kind of hold up a particular archetype that we want to see in the cube, or they're just really good cards or cards that we want to see coming up in drafts. And then finally, we have build around. And this is kind of the trickiest category and probably the least common one. So build around cards are, as the name suggests, cards that need a little bit more support, maybe kind of a fun combo piece, or could be part of a really interesting deck, but may or may not work depending on what else ends up in kind of the final version of the cube. So build around cards are ones that we find really interesting, but we're not quite sure if the rest of the cube is going to support them.
Yeah, and if you want to see each of those ratings, for example, from past episodes, if you go to clockspinning.com, we've got a link there to the cube on CubeCobra, and you can see kind of how the cube is evolving. You can see the ratings we've given each card that we've rated already. You can give the cube a test draft if you do. That's awesome. Let us know. We'd love to see those test drafts. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the cube, what cards you hated, what things didn't make sense to you. So check out clockspinning.com if you're curious to see the cube, or if you want to subscribe to the show. If you're just listening for the first time and you're liking what you have heard so far, you can find links there to your favorite podcast app or to YouTube if you prefer to listen there. The YouTube videos are not super sophisticated, but we do have a picture of each card come up at the appropriate time, so you can see the cards in a convenient fashion.
For sure. Austin did some great work there to get all those cards to pop up.
I don't know, but I did a very messy, ugly bash script, and I hope none of my programmer friends ever see it, but it works, so whatever works. One other note on that is, you're sort of joining us midstream if this is your first episode. As I said, we reviewed all of Champions Kamigawa, and so if you want to go back and listen to 22 hours of content about that, you're welcome to, but don't feel obligated. If you just want to dive in here, it's not necessary, although I would maybe recommend that Kamigawa White episode if you're curious to know more about the block, because we go much deeper into the history of the block and the design and where it fits in Magic's history, if that's interesting to you.
For sure. Well, should we dive into the first 15 white cards of Betrayers of Kamigawa?
Yeah, I'm glad to be doing it. Let's go. All right, well, I'm leading us off here with Day of Destiny. Day of Destiny is 3 and a W for a legendary enchantment. legendary creatures you control get +2/+2. This is just a really cool card. One of the things that's cool and somewhat unique about it in this era of Magic is that it says legendary creatures you control, which we're still at a stage in Magic's history where most lords and a lot of Anthem effects help everybody. And so it's kind of refreshing to have one that doesn't lead to the weird play problems that a lot of those old Anthem effects create, where the board just turns into a giant stall because you're both doing something similar. Uh, this card itself is interesting and I think tough to rate. On the one hand, the hit rate here is pretty poor. I was just taking a glance at the cube as it exists right now. About a third of our creatures are legends. That's not a terrible hit rate, but it's not great. Like +2/+2 is a big stat boost. But then if you think about like just a generic cube environment, Glorious Anthem and other generic Anthem effects like that, or Spear of Heliod, are generally pretty lousy in cube. Like 3 mana is just too much, 4 mana is extra too much. And if you just kind of do the math and assume that like a third of your team is going to be legends, this basically says plus 0.67 plus 0.67 or something like that. Like this is just not this card just doesn't really get there on rate for me. I still have it a meh because the art is awesome and the effect is kind of super Kamigawa-ish and it's a cool card, but I don't think it's a particularly good one.
Yeah, I mean, flavor-wise, this is an awesome card to open with. You've got this epic name, Day of Destiny. It's a legendary enchantment, which is, you know, at this point in Magic, kind of a new thing. And the art is, you know, Takeno, the samurai general who leads under Konda, who's like the big villain in the story of the set, leading this charge with his hound next to him. It's all super cool, but I agree that the card itself is probably not too great.
Yeah, you mentioned in your notes here the flavor text is pretty cool too. Do you want to read it?
Oh yeah, it says, "Rise like the sun, stand like the mountain, charge like the lion, die as a hero." And that's quoting General Takeno, who's in the art with the dog, which I think must be Isamaru.
Oh man, that's cool too.
Card
Yeah,
from Champions. So yeah, there's all this awesome flavor tie in here. I don't know how how much the card is actually going to help you achieve a Day of Destiny.
yeah, it does. I had this in a meh, but to me, I almost wonder: is this a build around? Is this just like, hey, if you want to try for legendary tribal, there's a payoff? I think part of the problem is there's a payoff, right? There's not like that many cards in the block that really pay you off for playing legends, so it's a little tricky even as a build around.
Well, the last card that we'll talk about in this episode is also kind of legendary tribal, Yomiji, who bars the way. So
Yeah,
I kind of like that,
okay,
actually.
that's 2.
So yeah, you've got your white legendary tribal with 2 cards.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting.
I mean, it would feel wrong to just cut this immediately. So I kind of like build around.
All right, let's give it a build around 1x. That feels right. Because, yeah, I agree. Just cutting something this cool and this Kamigawa-ish just feels wrong.
All right, let's do it.
It doesn't see a ton of EDH play from what I can tell, which I kind of get because EDH is not really about this. But it does see some marginal play in like Arvad and other kind of Legends Matter commanders. This is the first card in the episode, and I'm already dunking on commander color identity. So put one in the bingo card for that. But I have a Reiki History of Kamigawa commander deck. I sure wish I could put this in there because that would be so thematic. But alas, it doesn't work out.
Yeah. I love that the majority of the top commanders that show up for Day of Destiny on EDH Rec are either Yoshimaru, Ever Faithful, or a partner of Yoshimaru. Yoshimaru is this 1 mana 1/1 legendary dog. Just this adorable little dog sitting on a throne that says, whenever another legendary permanent enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Yoshimaru. And I just love the idea of Yoshimaru having his Day of Destiny.
I love that too. And isn't Yoshimaru like canonically a descendant of Isamaru? I'm pretty sure. It's got to be, right?
That checks out.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. Build around 1?
Yep. Okay, so Austin gets to start with Day of Destiny. I start with Empty Shrine Kanushi. 1 white mana for a 1/1 human cleric. Empty Shrine Kanushi has protection from the colors of permanents you control. This card just is immediately going to kind of the worst things about Kamigawa. Super weak creature with an almost, I think, irrelevant ability because it's such a small body. Like a 1 mana 1/1 is just not doing anything in Kamigawa Limited, I don't think. And giving him protection doesn't really do much either, even if you are able to, give him protection from colors that your opponent is actually playing, which is by no means guaranteed.
Yeah, it's kind of there's not really any good auras or power toughness boosting auras in the set anyway. One of the few that I think is marginal is like Indomitable Will, a white one. But of course, ironically, Empty Shrine Kanushi can't wear it because he gets protection from white. So yeah, this is just a super awkward design.
Yeah, I mean, what are you supposed to do with this guy?
Yeah, it's one of those cards that kind of really, to me, it's like someone thought, well, this is cool that we can do this in the rules. You know what I mean? It's like an intellectually fun design. But then when you start kind of taking it apart, it's like, well, what do you, like, you can't build a deck around this. Like, just in what environment is this card interesting? Or, does this lead to interesting play patterns? It's just really hard to see.
Yeah, and like with a lot of Kamigawa cards, it doesn't feel like it's worth the brain power to think about where this could possibly fit into anything, because the payoff is not going to be there.
Yeah, I also think you're a little easy on it in terms of the art, because I think his expression's super lame. It's just super, I guess, derpy for want of a better word. I don't really like the art much either.
So the only thing I like about the art, it shows, I guess, this cleric sitting here with his eyes closed and a derpy facial expression, and his hands are kind of reaching out, and there's these 3 origami birds flying around him. One of them is white, one of them is blue, one of them is green.
Do you think
So he's
those
got
relate
these.
to the colors of magic, Connor?
I don't know. There's no way for us to tell. So he's got these obviously Bant origami birds flying around him, and I kind of like how on the nose that is.
It's fun that they're just allied colors. Like instead of all 5, it's just
Yeah.
white and it's allies instead of
Yeah.
the enemies. That is kind of cute.
So it's the Kanushi's buddy colors that are with him.
All right. I did find one mildly interesting thing to say about this from, I don't know, where even was this? Like some Reddit comment where someone was taking Empty Shrine Kanushi. Okay. You finding this? Following this so far?
Mm-hmm.
Making it colorless with Ursat's gnomes.
Okay.
And then enchanting it with Mantle of the Ancients, which I think just creates some kind of loop where the Mantle of the Ancients lands on the thing and then comes back to the thing over and over for reasons I can't really explain. But if you're a rules nut, go look that up. That seems sort of marginally interesting. Although honestly, I didn't really bother to understand it fully, so I don't know that it's that interesting.
I'm glad we're talking about it here.
But basically, you can lock the game down into an infinite loop with just a Mantle of the Ancients on a colorless Empty Shrine Kanushi. It will just keep resurrecting the mantle forever.
Okay.
So
yeah, that's fun.
So that's cool.
Cool.
Is this an Instacut, Connor?
This is an Instacut for me.
Yeah. Okay. With extreme prejudice, I think.
Get it out.
All right. Let's talk about Faithful Squire. All right, this is our first flip card of the set, so bear with me. There's going to be a lot of rules text. Faithful Squire, 1 WW, creature, human, soldier, 2/2. Whenever you cast a spirit or arcane spell, you may put a key counter on Faithful Squire, that's KI. At the beginning of the end step, if there are 2 or more key counters on Faithful Squire, you may flip it. And then it flips into Kaiso, Memory of Loyalty. It's a legendary spirit, 3/4, flying. Remove a key counter from Kaiso. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to target creature this turn. Whew. Okay, I feel like we need a quick recap. 3 mana 2/2 with what's called Spirit Craft, which is an unnamed mechanic where when you cast a spirit or arcane spell, you do something. So 3 mana 2/2 Spirit Craft to get key counters. When there are 2 or more, it flips into a 3/4 flyer. They can remove those key counters to prevent damage. Still complicated even after the recap. This card is hard to understand and evaluate. The flip condition here is easier than many of the other flip cards throughout the block. White has a lot of spirit synergy. It has less arcane synergy, to be totally honest. In this case, I quite like the body that we flip into. 3/4 flyer with 2 combat trick tokens is pretty good rate. It's the kind of thing that will pretty quickly close out a game. It'll make combat damage math pretty nightmarish for your opponent. So I really like the flip condition here. There's a whole cycle of these, which may not be a surprise when you read it. There's a whole cycle of these key counter creatures where a mortal turns into a spirit based on getting 2 key counters. I think the white one might be the best one. So the blue one counters spells unless the caster pays 2. The black one gives fear. The red one is a threaten effect. And the green one gives +2/+2. Yawn. I think the white one is the best. That said, after that gigantic word storm, I also have to note this card has just 4 Gatherer comments in like the 10 years that there were Gatherer comments for this card.
Oof.
I can't find any mention of this in the history of Reddit. This card is pretty pretty forgettable and unlovable, and so I kind of wonder if I'm just talking myself into thinking it matters when maybe it's just like, you know what, who cares? These are convoluted and no one cares.
I mean, there are a couple things that bother me about this whole cycle of flip cards. The first one is it's just so slow. Like, even if you have the spirits to get key counters on Faithful Squire, I mean, what turn are you doing that on? Like 5 or 6 or 7 even? To the point where you can flip it into Kaiso and then you end up with a 3/4?
Yeah, it's true. The one thing I will say for it that's kind of surprising in this time is that it flips at end step instead of upkeep, which feels impossibly generous for Kamigawa era.
It does.
But I kind of think that might be because it's so hard to flip them. They, had to do that. You know what I mean? Like, they're so not that good.
Yeah, I mean, imagine getting the 2 key counters on your Faithful Squire and then having it die on your opponent's next turn while you're waiting for it to flip. That's actually another thing that bothers me about the design of these. Not that I think this change would make it better, but the fact that it has to flip when you have 2 or more key counters on there.
No, it says you may flip it. It's a may.
Oh, you may flip it. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you want, you can keep it as a gray ogre.
You could keep charging it up.
That does point to one of the problems with pretty much all flip cards, which is if you're not familiar with the flip cards, you may be thinking that we're talking about a transform card and we're saying the wrong word. Like, you flip the whole card over and it's double faced. That is not true. So this is a predecessor technology to double face cards. So the entire card is fit on the front face of the card. And so the art is this teeny little postage stamp with 2 pictures crammed into it. Each of the text boxes are like half the size of a normal Magic box. It's super, super crowded and confusing. And one of the consequences of that physical design constraint is that basically almost every front half of a flip card in the set doesn't do anything except tell you how it flips, and this is no exception. So like, Faithful Squire doesn't get any abilities. He doesn't even get like Bushido 1 or Vigilance or anything. He's just a gray ogre, and a double designated gray ogre at that. And so if you never do flip this, the feel bads here are very real. It's just a really bad creature.
That's a great point. That the just the formatting of these cards means that the unflipped state basically has no space to tell you anything other than how to flip it.
Yeah, there's like a cycle in Champions where they flip, they like tap to do something. Like, what's the black one that we both love? That shreds your opponent hand. What is that?
Oh yeah, I think
the Nezumi
flips into Stab Whisker. The Odious, I think. Stab.
I hear us both.
Yeah,
Nezumi short thing.
Yeah,
all
so
right.
He forces your opponent to discard. So that's kind of an exception and a little more interesting. But yeah, for the most part, especially with this cycle, because you've got that Spirit Craft trigger description on the first line of the unflipped state, and then you've got this key counter business, there's just no room for it to be anything but a gray ogre.
Actually, this is an example where one of the weird things about this block is that they didn't keyword the whenever you play a Spirit or Arcane spell thing is just Spirit Craft. If they had keyworded that and instead of said may put a key counter, just said Spirit Craft put a key counter on Faithful Squire, they could have fit another line of rules text on all of these.
Yeah. We don't know if they actually would have added any other keywords.
Yeah, that's true. They probably would have said, this is already plenty.
Yeah, this is all you get. Too much.
Why is that? Sorry, before we get to rating this, I get why the may flip it. I don't really get why may put a key counter. Like, what circumstance would you not want to put a key counter on here?
That is a great question. What key counter punishes exist out there?
I don't think there is one. It could be, there's like a thing in organized play where if you miss a mandatory trigger, you face like game sanctions, like you can take a game loss. Whereas if you miss an optional trigger, you don't. So there might have been some kind of organized play consideration there.
That's interesting.
You see what I'm saying? Because it's like if you miss your own beneficial trigger, but even then, I think if it's a beneficial trigger, I'm getting out of my depth here. But all that to say, I just make this a must. Like, just may just seems like totally unnecessary here.
Yeah. So where do we land on Faithful Squire and Kaiso?
I had it as a meh 1X, and I think that's mostly guilt. Like, I feel like flip cards, this was their only block. I feel a sort of protective instinct towards all of them. That
Hmm.
said, I think this is pretty bad. It's like a very conditional gray ogre that turns into a somewhat above rate creature. So I could be persuaded that meh 1X is just too generous.
Yeah, I have it as an Instacut, but part of me wants to have at least one of these key flip cards in, and maybe it does. Maybe it should be this one.
Hmm.
I
It's
could
hard to
tell we have
muster
some
too
very
much
strong feelings.
enthusiasm.
Maybe
I just,
maybe we just need to cut it then.
it's such a boring card. I think we should just cut it. I think the
All right.
fact that we're struggling to feel any emotion tells me this doesn't really need to be in the cube.
Yeah, if we're trying to talk ourselves into having it, we probably should.
Into a meh.
All right, let's talk about a card that I think we feel a lot more favorable about. Final Judgment. 4 white for a sorcery. Exile all creatures. This used to be just the most awe-inspiring card to me back in the day. Kind of like Day of Destiny, the name, the art, the flavor text they just all hit for me. The flavor text is the clashing warriors turned to face Okagachi, the greatest kami, and their sigh of awe was their last breath. And the art shows Okagachi, this gigantic serpent god, looming over this battlefield, and obviously about to destroy everyone on it. It's just like the kind of card that creates this sense of, majestic power that I think Kamigawa is so effective at.
Yeah, I think this is an example of like one of the things that's kind of remarkable about Magic of the rules text here is like in the modern words, like it's like three or modern rules templating, it's like 3 words, right? It's like exile all creatures. And somehow the combination of that clean but super powerful effect and this sort of awe-inspiring art, like it does create this feeling of awe from a little like 3-inch piece of cardboard, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it. Yeah, this card for me is one of the iconic, certainly arts in the whole block. Like I love the way Okagachi just looms so large that it actually takes a second or two to realize they're even human figures in the art.
Yeah.
And the way that Okagachi doesn't look particularly violent or malicious or even that interested. It's just sort of the effect of his passage or of his interest or something, like something there's just something so epic about this. It makes you feel very small.
Hmm. The simplicity of this card is a little bit like Omniscience that we talked about in the 7+ mana enchantments
Yeah,
episode,
yeah,
part
yeah.
one. Very, very simple card text that, still manages to create this great sense of power.
Hmm.
Looking at this card now, it's kind of hard to not, compare it unfavorably to a card like Farewell. But I think this definitely has a place in our cube, both just as like an awesome card and the only unconditional board wipe in the whole block.
Yeah, rate wise, this card is pretty bad, right? It's like wraths are a funny thing where like the difference between a 4 mana wrath and a 5 mana wrath is gigantic. Like a 4 mana wrath can be almost oppressive. They've avoided them in standard pretty much for the longest time. But a 5 mana wrath is usually a bit too slow for most formats. And so a 6 mana wrath is like really definitely a bit too slow for most formats. But our cube is slow. This is our only wrath, and there are a lot of graveyard shenanigans in this block, and so I think this does go up. The exile rather than destroy is pretty darn relevant in this case. It is kind of ironic that this is the final judgment of the head of all the spirits, and this most punishes the spirits. There's something there that feels a little funny to me.
Right. It's the soul shift that suffers here, not the mortals.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of that, like, why is this card not arcane?
Oh,
We
that's a great question. I have
Yeah,
a
I mean, we
theory
saw
about it.
plenty of cards like that in Champions where we're like, why is this not an arcane spell? What's your theory?
My theory is this was intended to be the new Wrath of God. So this is around the
Hmm.
time that Wizards stopped putting Wrath of God into every core set. And I think they were trying to like power down board wipes, make creature decks more viable. So they gave this a purposefully generic name and no arcane subtype. The only flaw in that plan is this card is actually just not good enough to see play in like a standard format.
I like that theory. I think that makes sense.
Like it's notable to me that this is a like a major wrath in the history of the game, and it's only been reprinted once in the list, and it's still like $2. To me, that tells you a lot about its power level.
Yep.
One thing I thought was fun is this is actually one of the first Exile Wraths in the history of the game. And basically the first unconditional normal one in white. So I'll put a link in the show notes to all of the Exile based removal I could find in the game in the history of printing. This is only the 24th white card ever printed that exiles a thing. And weirdly, a huge proportion of those before this were just targeting enchantments. Don't ask me why that is. More importantly, or more relevantly, this is only the third unconditional exile thing in the history of the game. Exile all creatures thing in the history of the game. So the first one is a card called Apocalypse from Tempest, which is, wait for it, red. 2 RRR. Exile all permanents, discard your hand. Yeah, interesting EDH troll card. And then in Urza's Destiny, we have False Prophet, 2 WW 2/2 Cleric, that when he dies, you exile all creatures. And that's it. And then you get to this. And this is the first kind of real white exile-based Wrath, which I think is kind of cool.
Wow. Yeah, kind of a historic card.
Yeah, it is. And as a side note, that also led me to a really weird... There is technically one other white card that exiles all creatures, kind of, from the dark, which I'm just going to share because it's so weird. It's called Martyr's Cry, WW Sorcery. Exile all white creatures. For each creature exiled this way, its controller draws a card. So just chew on that for a bit, because that is one weird card.
Some pretty great art there, too.
Yeah, the art's amazing. Oh, we should have mentioned from the start, because we keep talking about art. If you scroll down in the show notes, there's going to be a link that's like, see all cards from today's episode. If you just click on that, it'll let you see all the cards as we talk about them if you want to follow along.
Mm-hmm. So how do you rate Final Judgment? This is an auto-include for me, just on kind of iconicness alone.
I kind of forgot that we hadn't rated, because I just sort of assumed this was going in the cube. Yeah, auto-include sounds good.
All right.
Probably just one of them, right?
I think just one, yeah.
All right. Okay, so we talked about the key counter mortal flip card cycle. Let's go to our next weird cycle of the block. Genju of the Fields. W. Enchantment Aura. Enchant Plains. Buckle up. 2 mana. Until end of turn, Enchanted Plains becomes a 2/5 white spirit creature with, whenever this creature deals damage, you gain that much life. It's still a land. When Enchanted Plane is put into a graveyard, you may return Genju of the Fields from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, so 1 mana aura that turns the plains into a thing that can become a 2/5 with lifelink for 2 mana. And this comes back if the creature dies. I really like this cycle. There's a whole cycle of these Genjus. There's one for each color, plus a 5-color one. It's a super rare and unique effect, more rare than you would think. There's actually just 16, as far as I could tell, auras in Magic that turn lands into creatures in this way for like a mana cost. 6 of those are in Kamigawa blocks. So these 5 normal Genju and the 1 5-color Genju. 2 more are in Neo, which I think is interesting. I wonder if that's a callback to the original Kamigawa block. One of the things I really like about these is that this gives you an insurance against 2-for-1s. When the Enchanted Plains dies, you get the Genju back. And so your risk here is pretty low. Interestingly, across those 16 cards in Magic, that insurance policy thing is surprisingly common. So only 2 of the 16 auras that turn lands into creatures. You sticking with me here, Connor?
I think so. So far, so good.
Okay, I'm going to link to that list of 16, by the way. Only 2 of those 16 don't give you some kind of insurance policy, which I think is interesting that Wizards has always recognized that. If you can name which of those 2 cards that enchant aura lands and turn them into creatures conditionally don't save the creature, then you win the Magic Trivia Prize forever. I think no Magic player could name those. Those are Living Terrain and A Wink in the Ancient. Okay. After that really long, weird side trail, I really like this card. To me, it's just like a thing. It's like a 2/5. It's basically a weird conditional 2/5 with lifelink. And I think a weird conditional 2/5 with lifelink is actually pretty okay. And I think this is a pretty iconic Kamigawa-ish cycle. The fact that you get this back when the creature dies, to me, makes this just totally solid and playable, even if I ignore the fact that I really would struggle to cut these because the Genju to me are so iconic.
I pretty much agree with all of that, but all of these Genju feel like trap cards to me. It sort of looks to my untrained eye, or it looked back in the day, like you could slap this on a plains on turn 1, and then turn 2, you've got a 2/5 lifelinker. Technically possible. But In actuality, what you get is a 2/5 on turn 3 if you want to be able to actually attack with it, because you need to tap 2 other land and not the planes that this is enchanting to have an untapped creature. And then you're not doing anything else on that turn 3. I agree that like a 2/5 lifelinker is pretty decent, and I agree that this is an iconic cycle and just a really unusual effect and something that I want to see, but it does sort of feel like a trap.
I think it's a little bit of a trap. I don't think this card is great, to be clear. I do think it's like good enough. I think it does a lot of what the Spirit White deck wants to do, which is to say it's really good at slowing down the game. Like a 2/5 lifelinker is a great way to kind of blunt your opponent's aggro strategy and kind of slowly just stall them out until you start dropping big creatures. And so I like it as a role player in the white spirits deck in particular. Although, of course, unfortunately, this doesn't interact with Spirit Craft or Soul Shift at all, which is a little bit awkward.
Yeah. One other thing that makes it a little bit trappy is that it has to be a plains that you're enchanting. And there aren't that many like good non-basic lands within Kamigawa itself. Of course, we're bringing some in from outside, as we discussed in our kind of mana base episode. But the fact that this has to enchant a plains makes it kind of tricky too.
I think that's a great point because we purposefully eschewed the kind of better dual lands, right? We don't have the OG duels, we don't have shock lands, we don't have tri lands. So none of our non-basic fixing lands actually, I think, except the Amonkhet cycling lands, none of them have land types. So you're right. This is awkward if you're a 2-color deck. Your mana base may struggle to really support this. But you only need one, right? You don't need like 5 planes to make this work. It's not like you need to pump white mana in to animate the thing. You just need 1 planes.
Yeah, that's fair. So how do you rate it?
I have it all the way up at playable, which I think is generous. I think I was kind of prepared to argue with you about it, and so I went in hot with a playable 1x.
I've got it at meh 1x, just because I feel burned by it by having thought of it when I was younger as a turn 2/5 lifelinker, and then realizing that it doesn't work that way.
It's just a grievance. I understand your grievance rating. I'm willing to go to meh. Okay. I do struggle to imagine cutting this cycle. Like they're so innocuous. Maybe we'll just run into them more in playtesting and find they really are terrible. But I think we're gonna find that they're an okay like 23rd card. Like the last card you don't cut will be Genju of the Fields. Hopefully. Yeah. Maybe it's the last card you do cut. I'm not sure.
Maybe. We'll find out. Let's try it.
What do you think of the art here, Connor, before we move on?
It's got some strong trypophobia vibes.
Oh boy, howdy does it. And I got a lot of trypophobia going on.
Yeah, it's a very, even by Kamigawa standards, very strange looking creature in here.
It's not very white looking to me or fieldish.
No. You can't really tell, like, what does it have to do with the fields? Which end of the Genju is which?
Yeah, it's like something from Dune or something.
Yeah. It's a great worm.
Pretty horrifying. Actually, all of the Genju, ironically, Genju of the Realm, which is like this weird toad guy, is the least horrifying. Most of the other Genju are pretty horrifying looking. Like I'm looking at Genju of the Fens here. He's actually also got a bit of trypophobia action going on.
Yeah.
Genju of the Spires is kind of like a monster from a horror movie.
He's kind of wormy too.
They're all pretty freaky.
Huh.
You know what I'm realizing too, Connor? This is the only one of the 5 monocolored Genjus to never be reprinted.
Oh, that's sad. Why is that? I don't think it's the worst of them.
It doesn't seem that much worse than the others. I mean, it's not like these were printed in amazing things, but like Genju of the Fens got printed in 2 dual decks and a mystery booster. Genju of the Cedars, also in a dual deck. Genju of the Falls somehow made it all the way to M25. He hit the big leagues. Which, I mean, seriously, M25, you couldn't find a more iconic Betrayers card than this to put in.
And Genju
of the Spires, also in M25. Weird. Why did Genju of the... Sorry, we're just on side notes here, but like, why did Genju of the Spires get a promo printing in Arena 2005, by the way? It has like a foil promo printing.
Who knows? Why is Genju of the Spires getting so much love?
I don't know. We'll have to decide when we get to the Genju of the Spires. All right, meh 1x for our trypophobia-inducing friend. That's hard to say.
Trypophobic Genju.
Trypophobic Genju. That would be a good card name. Okay.
That's good. All right. Next up, we've got Heart of Light. 2W for an aura that enchants creatures, prevent all damage that would be dealt to and dealt by enchanted creature. So this is kind of a weird, more expensive pacifism or arrest type effect. I thought that this was just really bad at first glance, but maybe it has some uses in Kamigawa. Like you could put it on your own sort of small weenie creature to turn it into like a permanent chump blocker, because it still allows attacking and blocking, but just prevents all damage to the creature. Or maybe you stick it on a creature with like an important non-damage ability to protect it from something. Maybe you run it in your enchantment-loving EDH deck?
Uh-huh. Yeah, to me, this is like a crappier version of Arrest. Arrest being, I think it was originally printed in Mirrodin. Arrest being 2 and a W, enchanted creature can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. I don't know. The fact that this doesn't really shut down the creature that much is pretty damning for me. I still have it at like a meh 1x, but that's only because white removal is at such an incredible premium in this set that maybe this gets there. But there's a lot of cases where this isn't going to do what you want. Like a lot of the legends, for example, have abilities that are really relevant. Like, for example, the next card we're going to talk about, Hokori Dust Drinker, just as a random example. Or, Maloku the Clouded Mirror, or the Dragons, or Oyobi who Split the Heavens, on and on, right? Like there's a lot of cases where this isn't really removing the creature because the damage isn't the thing you were scared of.
Well, see, that I kind of like that about it, because you can put Heart of Light on your own creature to turn it into a permanent.
I know, but that's
chump
like
blocker,
you've just 2-for-1'd yourself.
Maybe, but I mean, you put this on Bushi Tenderfoot, and it can block forever.
Yeah, I guess. Or you could have just put one good creature in instead of the Bushi Tenderfoot or this thing.
But there aren't that many good creatures in Kamigawa.
Yeah, I know. Before we get to decide on a rating, I also really don't like the art here very much. It's like a white ghostly lady surrounded by bugs. I don't really get the bugs. Is the Heart of Light protecting her against the bugs? Her heart is pure enough to protect against the bugs?
I think so. And I feel like being surrounded by bugs is kind of a theme in Kamigawa art.
It's so true. There are so many bugs in this set.
At least this one's not by Ron Spencer. If it was,
That's true. Can you imagine what Ron Spencer would have done with this?
Oh my god, they'd be way bigger and way grosser.
Yeah, why are there so many bugs? Why is Kamigawa so determined to trip my phobias?
2 cards in a row here.
I know.
Gone from holes to bugs.
I know. Well, plus Final Judgment, it's kind of raising some existential fears for me.
Yeah.
What happens
fear of exile
after this? Yeah,
after
fear of
judgment.
exile rather than death.
Right.
I don't know. Mea 1x or Instacut. I can't even care what we rate a card that's this bland.
Yeah, I mean, I had it at Instacut, but I feel like I've talked myself up to a Mea 1x. Let's try it out. White doesn't have enough removal. Let's give it a shot.
Sounds good. Okay, let's go on to one of my favorite cards in the entire block. Hokori Dust Drinker. 2WW, 2/2, legendary creature spirit. Lands don't untap during their controller's untap steps. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player untaps a land he or she controls. Okay, so Hokori is just a 4-mana 2/2 that is Winter Orb, which is an iconic vicious card from early Magic. Winter Orb has a pretty strong competitive history in the early game because you can break the symmetry through things like artifact mana, right? Your opponent is relying on lands for mana like a sucker. You're running, I don't know, I guess back in the day, you're running Moxen and all these other kind of artifact lands, and your opponent is like crying because they can only untap one thing, but now you're untapping all your things. And that's pretty cool. Or you just reach a point where you don't care, and the Winter Orb acts almost like a Armageddon, where your opponent's lands are all tapped down. You're beaten down with a couple of, I don't know, I guess back in the day, Savannah Lions, and your opponent is just crying because they can't deal with them. There's a lot of crying in my description of Hokori, which I think is appropriate. It's a card that's intended to create tears. The only problem with that is, and I love that kind of card. The problem with that is I don't think there's that much in Kamigawa that really supports doing that. Like, there is no artifact mana. Pretty much all the mana in the block, with the exception of a few really marginal green creatures, is based around lands. And so I don't know how well Hokori can actually act like an asymmetrical effect. And white is not a super good aggro color in this cube. I mean, no color is particularly good at aggro, But white's curve gets best at around 2 and especially 3 mana. So I just don't know if Hokori gets there as much as I love him.
Yeah, I mean that was the thing for me. Like this kind of effect, this trolly passive aggressive, like we're not playing Magic anymore effect
Seemingly
is
symmetrical, but not
right,
really.
right. It really fun in theory. In the cube, or really fun for the person playing it in theory. In the cube, I just don't think Hokori does anything except like stop the fun.
Well, and my worry is not that; it's that he doesn't stop the fun well enough either.
But I mean, he stops the fun for everybody.
Yeah, right. Because you don't have the tools to actually then close out the game or demonstrably take over the game as the Hokori player, right? You're both just kind of grinding and slow and weird.
Exactly. And you don't have the follow up to it or the setup. You're not gonna, unless you get exactly the green cards that you need to maybe generate some mana from creatures or some artifacts or something. Like there's just not enough support within the block for Hokori to do what we want him to do.
I'm worried you're right. I still have him as an auto include though because I like this card so much.
I have him as an instacut because I think he's just going to be like stopping all the fun when he comes down.
Oh dear.
I mean, maybe we can try it. Is build around appropriate here?
It kind of is, except there's
nothing to actually build around.
Nothing to make it work. Yeah, that's the unfortunate thing. I'm kind of okay with build around. Yeah, I can see that.
Maybe we put him in, we try him out, and then he pops up in a game. The game just stops,
or he does nothing. My worry is honestly that it's like he doesn't exist.
Right.
Because the other thing about this that's awkward is like this isn't really like 4 is starting to get a little bit late in the day to do this. I mean, obviously Armageddon costs 4, but Armageddon is a much more definitive like turn the game off button than this guy is, and it doesn't cost double white.
Right.
So I'm kind of obviously it would have been terrible for Hokori to be say a WW21 or a 1WW32 or something, but I kind of think he probably needs to be to make the grade. Before we render final judgment, this doesn't see a ton of commander play. Like as a commander, it's only 225 decks, although hats off to every one of those trolls. You are welcome in the clock spinning community. But like he appears in a decent number of decks. It appears in like 3,000 decks. Most notably, it's fairly commonly played with Derevi Imperial Tactician, who whenever Derevi enters the battlefield or a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may tap or untap target permanent. And so, of course, Derevi is pretty awesome with the Hokori because it lets you keep your opponent's stuff more tap down their mana rocks, for example, and it lets you untap your land. So that's a pretty cool set of interactions.
Yeah, I like that. Unfortunately, no Derevi in our cube.
Can you imagine? One other beef with Hokori after my Love Fest is there's a lot of cards like this in the block, spirits like this in the block, but this is another spirit that is absolutely flying in its art or is literally a cloud but does not have flying, and that just drives me bananas. It should totally be flying, and I think it would be fine if it was flying too. It wouldn't be overpowered. It would actually, I think, put him kind of in the right band of power level.
I totally agree, because then you've stopped the game and now you have a threat, a small one,
a little dinky threat,
a little some kind of threat.
Yeah, and it's kind of like if your opponent can answer a 2/2 flyer in that environment or situation, then serves them right,
Yeah, that's on them.
Yeah, we aren't errata cards, but honestly, it kind of makes me want to write flying on this thing with a Sharpie and just keep it in the cube like that.
Yeah,
it'd be less confusing if it had flying.
Yep, like so many other spirits here.
Yes.
So should we go with build around for Hokori?
We should, but I also think you need to talk about the secret lair drop thing that you're glossing over.
I'd almost forgotten about that. Hokori actually got some secret lair drop love just this year. There's a really cool piece by an artist named Yuko Shimizu, which depicts Hokori as basically a big, giant, swirly tornado with a huge red fanged mouth. It's, I don't know how to describe it. It looks almost like a wood block, and just really cute, actually, and fun.
Yeah, it seems like part of the role of this show is for you to point out secret lair drops that I missed that make me feel bad about missing them. And I definitely feel bad about missing this one. Although happily, this card is just $1 in the secret lair version. So I probably need to just get one because it's super cool art.
We should probably pick that up.
Yeah, I'm fine with the build around 1x. I don't know that it'll make it all the distance, but we can hope.
Yeah, let's try it. Okay, next up we've got Hundred-Talon Strike. 1 white mana for an instant arcane. Target creature gets +1/+0 and gains first strike until end of turn. You can also splice onto arcane by tapping an untapped white creature you control. So this is kind of a cool card, a nifty combat trick that has an unusual splice cost, at least compared to the splice cost that we've seen so far. Instead of paying mana, you are tapping a white creature you control. Not that not that you'd have to pay a lot of white mana to just cast this, but I don't think this is a very good combat trick. What do you think about it?
I think you're being a little bit harsh on it. Like, admittedly, I have a soft spot for combat tricks, and I've also got a soft spot for this totally crazy art. Super trippy, even by Kamigawa standards. Like, are those? It looks like there's Powerball balls floating around it. I don't
The
know.
art feels very Yu-Gi-Oh to me.
It is kind of Yu-Gi-Oh, but in a great way. But I don't know. I kind of respect this. Like, I think First Strike is probably the second best ability to have on a bad combat trick, right? After Death Touch. Like, First Strike wins combats. Admittedly, +1/+0 doesn't do a whole lot to help you get there. But the totally unique ability to splice by tapping a creature is pretty cool. And I do think puts this into a different, I guess what I think is it puts it into a territory where it's tough to evaluate. And I'm kind of reluctant to cut it for that reason. I feel like, yeah, this probably doesn't get there. And unfortunately, as I think you're about to point out about splice, the problem is that you have to have an arcane spell to splice onto, which is a big problem. But it is kind of unique and interesting. I kind of want to stick a couple of these in here and see if it can do something. No,
my issue with it is, first, you need something to splice onto. Second, to splice, you need to have another white. Well, maybe you need to have another white creature available that you can tap to cast this onto your attacking creature or whoever you're actually targeting with the Hundred-Talon Strike. And then the combat trickiness, the sneak attack value of suddenly giving something first strike totally disappears after you have spliced this once. Right? Now your opponent knows you have the Hundred-Talon Strike.
Yeah, but I feel like we have a philosophical disagreement here, because I think you rate sneakiness higher than I do. Of like, I don't care if it's sneaky. You know what? I want you to know it's coming. Like, I want you to feel scared that at any time I could give my creature first strike. Like, I think there's a it's like a deterrent effect. It's like letting your opponent, your enemy country, know about just how many missiles you have. Like, I mean, admittedly, the missile here is a +1/+0 in first strike. So I mean, it's not like the best missile in the world.
It's a modest missile.
I do think, like, the fact that it doesn't require mana to do the splice is pretty interesting. Or would be if there was any way to cast the original arcane spell without. Gosh, it doesn't quite work, does it?
It's interesting, but it to me it feels almost like kind of another trap card, because when I first read it, I'm like, oh, I can just like keep tapping other creatures I control and keep Hundred-Talon striking. But then you need to actually have a new arcane spell every time you want to do that. And I think most of the time you're not going to have it. And when you do have that arcane spell, is it going to be one that you want to cast at the same time that you need the Hundred-Talon Strike, right? Like, how many arcane spells are out there that you'd actually want to be casting at the time you would need to be splicing this strike?
Well, this is one of the most awkward things about this card, is that there's not, because white is one of the worst arcane colors of the colors that get arcane spells. I think splice in general is a really tough mechanic for us, because it's just been really hard to make it work in all our playtesting. I think in a retail draft environment, you just have all these crappy commons that are going to be at the table whether anyone wants them or not, right? And so it's like, if it's open, there's just going to be some arcane things, and someone's going to have to pick them at some point in the draft. But in our environment, it's like we're raising the floor on power level, and most of the arcane spells except Glacial Ray get left behind. But then if it's just Glacial Ray, that doesn't work. Like, arcane, I'm worried, is becoming a bit of a design pickle for us.
Yeah. And I feel like without that arcane support, Hundred-Talon Strike is just a 1 mana fairly lame combat trick. Like, the splice, I think, is most of the time gonna just be completely irrelevant.
All right, let's just insta-cut it and move on.
Let's cut it. I'm sorry.
I get it, Connor. I mean, I think you're right. It's just sad.
Yeah, it's a tough truth about Kamigawa.
Oh, man. All right, let's go to Indebted Samurai. 3 and a W for a 2/3 human samurai. He's got Bushido 1. This is actually our first Bushido card. So Bushido is whenever this blocks or becomes blocked, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. And whenever a samurai you control dies, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Indebted Samurai. I have this guy at a Meta 1x. I think this is like a totally decent curve filler. He's a 2/3 that fights as a 3/4, which for 4 mana is not great, but is not unreasonable in the low power environment of Kamigawa. And if he ever grows, he becomes like a totally reasonable threat. So I don't have a huge amount to say about this card, but I think it's pretty solid.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I've got it as a playable. I think we have enough samurai in the cube, or we will by the time we finish, to make this viable with the +1/+1 counters. Yeah, just seems like a pretty solid samurai.
Yeah. One interesting note is the artist here, Carl Critchlow, was kind of an OG Magic artist who did a lot of art up until around 2011. And then he's one of these artists, we've been remarking on this a lot in the last couple episodes, I think, who then took like a 10-year break from Magic and comes back in like 2020 and especially 2021, 2022 with a lot of pieces. I still don't have a theory about that, except maybe that Magic is just putting out so many cards now that they need all the artists they can get. But it's interesting. I remember in our 7 mana enchantment episode too, we were noticing artists who we just hadn't seen for like a decade, and a lot of them seem to be getting pulled back into the game, which is fascinating.
Yeah. This art though, I have so little feeling about
like it?
The samurai. His pose just looks pretty awkward. It's not really clear like what he is indebted to, or like how this what looks like a pile of bodies behind him relates to that. Yeah, just kind of awkward.
Against that, Connor, he also has like his arms are held weirdly far from his body.
Mhm.
I do have to ask you though, you've been on record throughout the years as being extremely pro pauldron, the piece of armor that covers your shoulder. And this guy's got some serious pauldrons.
I do love a pauldron, but I don't love these pauldrons. They're just sort of rectangles made of like grass, probably.
Yeah, it's actually kind of the Onslaught clerics. They all have this weird grass.
See, I love the Onslaught clerics. I love their aesthetic.
Goofier than this guy.
I love their aesthetic. This guy's pauldrons they're not doing it for me.
Okay, you feel like he's just kind of ripping off their style, but he doesn't really understand it.
Yeah. His pauldron game just isn't there.
He doesn't really have any kind of figure either. It's kind of like his body's totally. We're just nagging this guy. Let's move on.
Let's keep going.
What do you rate him? I have him in a Meh 1x.
I have him at playable. I don't feel strongly about it.
I kind of feel like 1x might be low. Like we'll see in the final cube, but I could totally see having 2 of these as just a decent mid-range threat.
Why don't we go wild and call it playable 2x?
How about we go wild and call it Meh 2x?
Okay. All right, I can live with
that. I think if I think about our Meh rating, and part of the intent is that these are the flex cards that get cut from the cube or get added based on the final shape of the thing. Like no one would cry if we were like, we have a Champions Kamigawa block cube, but it doesn't have any Indebted Samurai. I don't think anyone would be like, no, I love that card.
That's fair. All right. Okay, next up we've got Kami of False Hope. 1 white mana for a 1/1 spirit. Sacrifice Kami of False Hope to prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn. So this is a pretty popular card in a lot of kind of recursion-oriented EDH decks that use it as this sort of fog on a stick. You sack the Kami of False Hope to protect yourself from lethal or do whatever combat trickiness you want to be doing, and then you just keep getting it back over and over again and have this constant fog effect you can use. That said, it has never been reprinted ever, despite its popularity and I think sort of general okayness and actually really cool art. Within the cube, I'm not sure.
I agree about the cube and that this card is super cool. Like it does something pretty much unique in the game. The art to me is some of the best art in the this block is just full of incredible art. And I think this is one of the more incredible ones. Like if you just zoom in on it, obviously the figure is cool. Like it's humanoid, but also clearly alien and spirit-like. We've got these kind of yin yang symbols that I think sort of symbolize the spirits and the humans and the opposition between them, but also potential balance, yada, yada. And then in the background, you've got like these 2 samurai on the left facing off against this kind of wacky multi-eyed spirit monster on the right. It's a really cool piece of art. I love this card.
Yeah, he's the Kami is sort of standing in like between the battle lines of these humans and Kami, it looks like. And there's like blood on one side of him and I guess green spirit blood on the other side
Spirit
of
goo,
him.
yeah.
Spirit ooze, ectoplasm. Yeah. So the art is awesome. What do you think of it for our purposes here?
Ugh, I think it's pretty dicey. There's not a lot that lets you exploit this. So this seems to see a fair amount of this has seen some EDH play, for example, in Celestial Kirin decks as like a ultra trolly way to kind of keep beating down with your opponent. And definitely when you can recur this, it gets pretty cool pretty quick. Like there's some kind of turbo foggy. I think modern lists even have played this. It's kind of like a fog forever kind of thing. In our cube, we don't really have that much recursion potential outside of Soul Shift. So I'm not really sure that it's good. And it's a one drop, and one drops are usually terrible. That said, this might be the one drop I'm willing to give some kind of chance to.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'd like to try it, just if only for its cool art and sort of unusual history as a Kamigawa common actually having some relevance in formats.
Yeah, and a common that's like $16 in foil now. I assume mostly
Whoa.
on the back of this amazing art. I don't know.
Huh.
So I had it as an Instacut. How high did you go in your rating?
I went playable, but I think meh is probably more correct because this is probably in a lot of situations not doing a whole lot for you, but I'd still like to see him pop up now and then.
Yeah, I'm fine with a meh. 2x seems okay. I don't know that it's going to make it all the way there, but 2 seems fine.
Okay. Let's go with meh 2x.
Boom. All right, let's talk about Kami of the Tattered Shoji. Kami of the Tattered Shoji is 4 and a W for a 2/5 spirit. Whenever you play a spirit or arcane spell, Kami of the Tattered Shoji gains flying until end of turn. Okay. I my notes on this basically just say whenever you play a spirit or arcane spell, you are reminded the Kami of the Tattered Shoji doesn't already have flying, despite having a terrible stat line and the art showing it like basically about to take off and fly. I really dislike this card. It's one of those Kamigawa cards that, yeah, it might get there on raid. Yeah, it might technically be playable in the format, but just I don't like how it's like confusing and deceptive on the face of it. I don't like how it doesn't do anything that interesting. Like conditionally gaining flying is pretty boring. The thing that bums me out about this card is I think the art is pretty cool here. Like there's almost a mech vibe from this thing. And the artist here,
Yeah.
Shishizaru, turned in like a bunch of bangers like this card, Floating Dream Zubera, Jugon the Rising Star, Kodama of the North Tree, Bounteous Kirin, Even the Odds. All of these cards have amazing art and are pretty bad. And I'm thinking he just left because he was tired of Wizards wasting his cool art.
Yeah, that seems fair. I don't hate the sort of tie-in between the effect and the art here. You know, you've got this Kami of with these tattered wings. These its wings are shoji, which is like a door or a window on a like a lattice frame. So I kind of like the idea of it like sometimes having flying, or you know, it's this sort of feeble, weakened Kami that occasionally is able to take to the air. But the fact that you get sometimes flying on a 5-mana 2/5 body is just reprehensible.
It's pretty damning.
I think we just got to cut this.
Yeah, sounds good. Insta cut.
All right. Okay, we have another Kami here. Kami of the Honored Dead. 5 WW for a 3/5 spirit with flying. Whenever Kami of the Honored Dead is dealt damage, you gain that much life. It also has Soul Shift 6. And I think this is our first Soul Shift card in Betrayers. So just as a reminder, Soul Shift is when the creature is put into a graveyard from play, you can return a spirit card with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to your hand. So when Kami of the Honored Dead dies, you get a spirit back from your graveyard with CMC 6 or less. So this is a card that I don't think I ever saw back in the day or had given any real thought to before the moment that I rated it. It has this strange and, as far as I can tell, almost unique reverse lifelink kind of ability, where instead of you gaining life based on how much damage it deals, you gain life based on how much damage it is dealt. And as far as I could tell, there were only 2 other much older cards that have this kind of ability.
Yeah, that's kind of the most notable thing about this, right? I feel fine about this thing. It's, you know, to me, it's like it's a 7-mana 3/5 flyer. So, you know, that's not really that good. But the soul shift is helpful here. The reverse lifelink to me is like kind of cute, but I think in general, you'd much rather just have real lifelink on this. Like, I can't imagine too many scenarios where you'd prefer this weird ability versus just every time you attack your opponent and it doesn't get blocked, you get some life. I don't know. This is pretty meh. This is like a poster child for meh to me.
Yeah, It does feel pretty. I mean, the soul shift definitely helps, but I don't think this is anything more than a meh.
Yeah, I think the most awkward thing to me about this is the 7 mana. Like 7 is hard to get to. There's just this huge gulf between 5 and 6, and especially 6 and 7, and then 7 and 8 mana, where there's a lot of games where you never see 7 mana, or you don't see it till, turn 12 or turn 13 or whatever. And like, I don't know, by the time this thing comes down in a lot of cases, I think it's not really doing what you want it to. The best example of that is going back to Champions of Kamigawa. There's card called Vine Kami, which is a 7 mana 4/4 Soul Shift 6 with Menace. And that thing, every time I've drafted it, it disappoints me because I'm like, I just don't get to cast this. And then by the time I do, it doesn't matter. And I do think something similar might be true here, but I still think one of these is fine. I think this is mostly held up for me by the uniqueness of it and the like super Kamigawa-ish art and name.
Yeah, the art is definitely very Kamigawa. First off, you've got a Genju, the big castle that I guess is the seat of power for Kanda. That is prominently in the background. And then the Kami itself is this really weird, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, it looks like some sort of bodily organ surrounded.
Like a blood clot or something.
Yeah, like a blood clot surrounded by wormy things and
wormy wings,
feathery appendages,
wings,
maybe?
Silk moth, silkworm wing things.
Yes, some silkworm wing things, and then a sword right in the middle. So very, very strange.
And masks, like laughing, almost like theater masks hovering around it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely some art that could only exist in this set.
Absolutely.
Which, that counts for something.
Yeah. So, let's keep one of them around.
Yeah, Meh 1X feels perfect.
All right.
Okay, let's talk about Kentaro, the Smiling Cat. 1 and a W for a legendary human samurai. 2/1. Bushido 1. You may pay X rather than pay the mana cost for samurai spells you play, where X is that spell's mana value. Okay, it's a weird card. So it's a 2 mana, 2/1, Bushido 1. And then he basically makes all your samurai colorless. I think this is pretty darn good. Most of the samurai are white, but there is a smattering of red samurai, and then I think just a handful in the other colors across the block. And one of the questions we've had throughout Champions is like, can the samurai deck be 2 colors? Like, are the red samurai good enough to be worth splashing? And then Kentaro says, no problem. I'm like a mana fixing spell in white, admittedly just for your samurai. And I think, like, honestly, that's plus being a 2/1 with Bushido 1 is basically good enough to get there in this set. So yeah, I like Kentaro. I have him as an auto include. I can't say I have like passionate feelings about him, but I like that he does something pretty unique, and he kind of acts like mana fixing in white, which is interesting from a design perspective.
Yeah, I really love this card. Just being a 2 mana 2/1 with Bushido 1 is already pretty decent as a rate, and then the fact that this lets you get into those red and also black samurai. There are a few black samurai in the block. I think there's one green samurai even. And I just love the idea of Kentaro letting you splash into these other samurai and mana fixing in this very, very specific, very thematic kind of way. His flavor text sort of alludes to that too. It says, the bonds of Bushido will draw the dishonored back someday, and I will be there waiting, which kind of, alludes to samurai from other colors coming back, but the way it ends with I will be there waiting, and his art showing him like holding this katana in a very threatening way, kind of.
He doesn't look like he's welcoming you, does he?
Yeah, he's not there waiting to bring them back into the fold. He may be waiting to do something else to them.
Mm-hmm. I also don't like that his name says he's smiling, but he's not really smiling in the art.
He's not really smiling in the art.
I know.
And that's a great point. He's also not a cat.
Good point. This card is all kinds of confusing, Connor.
It is. But this art I hate in general.
Wow. Okay. We're on record in this podcast as being huge fans of Donato Giancola's photorealism. So why are you hating on this art?
Because of the photorealism. There was another Donato Giancola piece in Champions. I think it's Hisoka, like a blue wizard, that's extremely photorealistic, especially the face. And I just find it really jarring. And in this art in particular, the color of his face, he's very pale. It stands out really, really starkly from this very dark blue background and these very dark clothes that Kentaro's wearing. And there's just something about the way that like his face is framed and sort of like floating in this dark shapeless mass of the rest of the piece of art that like really doesn't work for me.
It looks a little bit like it's superimposed on the art, doesn't it? It doesn't kind of meld nicely together.
It doesn't. And the background doesn't like tell any kind of story about this legendary samurai. It doesn't give him any
What
kind
background?
of any place. Exactly.
It's just like swirls.
Swirls of they're nice swirls, but feels very mismatched and contextless.
So even though I've joined you in kind of not loving this art, I actually think I do like it the more I look at it. I like that what is it I like about it? I like that it kind of tells a story. Like he does have a sort of interesting, ambiguous facial expression. Maybe he's a smiling cat in the same way that the Mona Lisa is smiling. Like, is he smiling? It's a little bit ambiguous. I'm intrigued that he looks incredibly young and he's a little bit androgynous as well. And he's got this pretty cool armor. I don't know. There's something about it that I don't know. It's not my favorite of his pieces, but it's at least striking and unique, and like stands out within the set. So I have a soft spot even for the art here.
All right.
All right, you're not feeling it. What do you rate this thing as?
I've got him as an auto include 2x because I really want this mana fixing to work. This samurai mana
I really
fixing.
like that. I really like that. We've been 1x on every legend except, of course, the brothers Yamazaki. I like going 2x here, though. I think you're right. We can stand it in the samurai deck, and it will help make a bunch of other things work. That's clever.
Yeah, let's push this multicolored samurai deck a little bit more.
All right, auto include 2x.
All right. Next up, we've got Kitsune Palliator, our first Kitsune of today's episode. Kitsune Palliator is a 2W02 Fox Cleric that you can tap to prevent the next 1 damage that would be dealt to each creature and each player this turn. So the first thing I want to say about Kitsune Palliator is that we're on episode 14 of Clock Spinning. We've looked at hundreds of Kamigawa cards, and I don't think we have ever mentioned that the Kitsune, as shown here, do not have mouths.
You're right. How have we not mentioned that? It's one of the weirdest things about the set. Why don't the Kitsune have any mouths? Yeah, you're right. None of them have mouths.
I have no idea. And of course, the Kitsune in Neon Dynasty, who look, much more like Star Fox characters, definitely do have mouths. These original ones, as far as I could tell, don't. This Kitsune Palliator, is also very rat-like to me in its art.
Yes.
He's got kind of a Nezumi-shaped face, these large rat-like ears. I really wonder what was going on with the art direction of the Kitsune that made them look like this. I kind of like it, but it's weird for sure.
I actually love this art. There's something about the color scheme, like the red, his like silly red hat and his gold and white robe, that I get like a kind of Christmas vibe from this art. I struggle to explain why, but it's kind of like a rat from a Christmas Story or something.
Uh-huh.
You know, all those Christmas rats from children's books. So it's like one of those classic
Kitsune Christmas rat.
Yeah, it's one of those classic cartoon Christmas rats. And I think on a technical level, it's a pretty beautifully realized piece. Like there's a ton of detail packed in here, but not in a way that's busy or distracting. It's got an interesting dynamic pose. There's a pretty intense use of light that I think is pretty well rendered across the figure. Like the bright light from the magic he's casting is kind of well lit across his face and robes and silly purple hat. So we haven't talked about the card itself, which spoiler, it's bad, but I really like the art. It's just like it's like a cute Christmas magic rat, and I like him for that reason.
I love that. I think there's rats in the Nutcracker, aren't there?
That's right. That's probably what
So
I'm
there
thinking
are
of.
Christmas
Yes,
rats.
It's the Nutcracker rats. Yes, you're totally right.
Kitsune Palliator is the Nutcracker card.
Huh. Okay. What about the card itself here, Connor? Like the stat line and abilities.
I mean, a 3-mana 0/2 to me is just unforgivable, and like this tap ability to just prevent 1 damage to everything is just stally and unfun, and I think bad.
We've talked in a number of episodes now about how cards back when we learned to play Magic sometimes felt like to a young teenager, like IQ tests, like you're just not smart enough to understand why preventing damage from everything is good.
Preventing 1 damage from everything.
Yes, but judging by the Gatherer rating and the fact this has had 5 Gatherer comments, and no one has ever, as far as I can tell, said anything about this card in the history of the game, it wasn't a failed IQ test, Connor. I think this card is just bad and boring, minus the adorable art.
All right, I'm glad we can. I can rest easy knowing that I didn't miss anything with Kitsune Palliator.
Yeah, just a really weird card.
And an
I don't know
Instacut
what
for
it's
me.
meant to do. Yeah,
No.
totally Instacut. Totally agree. Okay, let's move on and talk about Mending Hands. W, instant. Prevent the next 4 damage that would be dealt to any target this turn. Okay, I felt like the easiest way to understand this card is just to list all the things to hate about it, because this is a hateful card in my view.
Okay.
So I'll just go quick, and then I'll let you expand on anything you want to expand on, or if there are things you like for some reason, you can say that too. So first, just let this also gain life. Like, damage prevention is not a good mechanic, sort of across the board. This prevents 1 more damage than Healing Salve, which is notorious for being one of the most unplayable cards relative to its brethren in the history of the game. So just make this like a version of Healing Salve that prevents 4 or gains 4 life. That is not going to break anything, and it at least would be interesting. Second, why is this not arcane? Like, obviously it's not arcane because there's mortals in the art, and boy, do I have more to say about these mortals in a second. But like, if this had been arcane, it at least would have had some role in the block. It's not like this was going to become some kind of staple in the history of the game that needed a generic name. Well, I guess they thought it was, because for some reason this was reprinted in 9th edition. I don't know what they were thinking there. And then finally, to me, this is an egregious example of like unnecessary boob art, where like for some reason our healer figure here is just leaning forward with this super low cleavage dress with her boobs like falling out. I don't know, it's just goofy. I hate this card.
Well, there's so much about the art to hate here.
Yeah, so go deeper.
The pose of
embrace our hate.
The pose of this Kitsune healer is just completely baffling to me. So she's leaning forward, as Austin mentioned, but her mending hands, are reaching apparently backwards behind her toward these other 2 Kitsune, just super generic warrior guys. So she's apparently healing them or mending them by like putting her hands backward behind her, I guess, so she can be facing the viewer and show us her cleavage. And then these other 2 guys she's healing, like one is sort of like looking over his shoulder holding a couple swords, the other one is facing completely away from us. For the only reason I can imagine for that is that the artist just got tired of painting faces, Kitsune faces. It's just like, this guy's going to be looking the other way, he'll be backwards. So there's just so much about this art that's like awkward and just unpleasant to look at. The only cool thing, the only redeeming quality here is the headdress that the healer is wearing. Is kind of cool. Other than that, I just hate this card through and through.
And even then, Connor, there's 3 pieces of headgear in this, and hers is kind of cool, but theirs are extremely silly.
Theirs are terrible. It's actually, their hats are kind of similar to your Kitsune Palliator's hat.
That is just true, saying. But he is cute, and they are not. They're just lame.
He is a Christmas rat. These guys are just lame.
We haven't really mentioned this yet, but another weird thing, I think we mentioned this in the Champions review, but the art direction on both the Kitsune and the Snake People, the Orochi, seems to have been pretty loose, because basically every card, the Kitsune look totally different. Yes. Like if you just contrast this and Mending Hands, like they both have long ears and pointed like kind of snouts, and then everything else about them, they don't look like the same species, even a little bit.
No.
Another one of the many flaws in this art is it's not really clear why she needs to prevent damage, because they don't really look like they're in a battle.
No, they don't look
getting injured or anything. They're just kind of standing there.
Yeah, what is she mending?
Yeah.
Also, the flavor text. Well, let's just finish dunking on this card and then we can cut it. The flavor text says, okay, I can staunch their blood, mend their flesh, and knit their bones, but I cannot restore their hope. Tender hand, Kitsune healer. There's no blood in this art. There's no flesh being mended. There's no bones being knit, and they don't really look very hopeless either.
Do all Kitsune not have pupils? Is this another thing we haven't noticed or commented on?
No pupils? You may be right.
Let's go look at some form.
I'm not seeing Kitsune. Any pupils.
Boy, that's weird.
Wow.
Okay. Right. So I'm taking it you're an Instacut on this one.
This is very easy Instacut.
Yeah, and I just double checked. It looks like none of them have pupils. I feel like we missed some homework here, so we may try to go figure out why the Kitsune don't have mouths or pupils, or if you know, like, please let us know in the comments or by emailing us at clockspinningpodcast@gmail.com. I'm pretty mystified.
Yeah, very curious about that.
Also, none of them really look like foxes, just as a kind of final note. Okay.
All right, let's get it.
That is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining us as we rendered final judgment on this day of destiny for Betrayers of Kamigawa white cards.
Oh boy.
If you have feedback, thoughts, or memories to share about any of the cards or topics that came up today, or about any Betrayers of Kamigawa cards that we haven't talked about yet, please let us know. You can email us at clockspinningpodcast@gmail.com, or just comment on Reddit or YouTube. If you'd like the show, consider subscribing if you aren't subscribed already, or, even better, share it with a Magic playing friend. If you have some Magic playing friend who really likes nerdy trivia about ancient formats, we'd love for you to share. You can also follow along as the cube evolves on CubeCobra. Just check out clockspinning.com for links to all of that stuff. Next episode, join us as we review perhaps more Betrayers of Kamigawa cards, or perhaps take another detour into some thematic episode. Until then, though, I'm Austin.
And I'm Connor.
Thanks for listening.